Welcome to Her Theology. My name is Cass. Thank you for joining us. For anyone that's new, I'm glad you're with us. This is a great episode to hop onto Her Theology and get to know what we are all about. And today I have an incredible guest with me. But before I introduce, I have to say, I have been busy the last few weeks getting in the depths of modern history, sociology, and understanding men. And I know that sounds really weird, but it is not. I'm not shy about this. I'm not a fan of feminism. And so when I heard about this book, I had to get my hands on it. And I have been brilliantly enlightened and encouraged all at the same time, and also gobsmacked, definitely gobsmacked, as I have read through The Toxic War on Masculinity and How Christianity Reconciles the Sexes. This book has been incredibly insightful. It's historic, it gives us data, and it also brings it right back to scripture. And so I have the greatest joy today to introduce you, listeners, to the author of this book, Professor Nancy Pearcey. Nancy, thank you for being on with us today. I really appreciate it.
Well, thank you for inviting me. I do appreciate it as well.
Yeah, it's been reading your book and then having the opportunity to actually speak to you and flesh it out and hopefully encourage all our listeners to go and buy the book and to read it. I have no doubt that this book is really going to impact the church. I think it's not just for women, it's for men, clearly, but it's for everyone, whether you're a leader in the church, whether you're just a congregant, it doesn't matter who you are. I think it's going to be really important. And it's for all ages as well. I think it's really a helpful book for the younger generation to wrap their head around what we're going through as a society, and then also helpful for the older generation to see how they can be such a helpful, help change that narrative and bring up the next generation in the right way. So thank you for writing it. I imagine it would have taken you a long time because there are countless footnotes. I am very impressed. How long did it take for you to write this book? I'm just curious.
Well, I have to tell you, the pandemic came in the middle, and so in one way that was good because then the publisher gave me an extension. And as you point out, there is a lot of research. What makes it unique is most Christian books on masculinity, on men, are sort of devotional books. How to be a better man of God, or you might call them Christian living, practical living books. It's kind of a how-to book, and this is not that, because I started out really. I'm an apologist, right? That means I'm somebody who likes to defend Christianity against our secular culture, and all my teaching, all my books are on apologetics. And so I'm looking at masculinity from an apologetics angle, saying, basically, how does the secular world get masculinity so wrong that it even denounces it as toxic? Where did that come from? Because you can't really stand against a social trend unless you know where it came from and how it developed. So I spent a lot of time in the book just showing, where did the concept of the secular script for masculinity, where did it come from, and how can we stand against it with a more biblical view?
Yeah. And so, because what I really appreciated about this book is I can see the hard work that's gone into it clearly, but the fact that you just have input from everyone from a variety of walk of lives. You have feminists that are not Christian, you have historians, you have Christians, you have everything. So it's a really robust book. It gives you the information that you need. And I think you've done a brilliant job at trying to show both sides and where they're coming from and present the logic in the middle of all that. So yeah, I value it a lot. Now I have to say, Nancy, I'm going to give our readers a bit of a bio about you first, and then I've got a question that's a little bit more personal. But for our listeners that don't know you, and hopefully I think a lot of our listeners have heard of you, because when I announced on social media I was interviewing, it was a resounding level of excitement. So you have quite a following here in Australia as well, which is great. But Nancy has written many books, many hugely successful books, including Love Thy Body, Answering Hard Questions About Life and Sexuality, The Soul of Science, Saving Leonardo, Finding Truth, How Now Shall We Live, and Total Truth. Her books have been translated into 19 languages, and she is a professor and scholar in residence at Houston Christian University. And she has been highlighted as one of the 5 top women apologists by Christianity Today, which is so encouraging for us as women and hailed us as one of America's preeminent evangelical Protestant female intellectuals, which is also really encouraging because I really believe all women can be theologians. I'm sure we can all be encouraged by the impact she's had and the way in which God has used her powerfully for her ministry. And I love Nancy's heart to just help shed light on the attitudes and presuppositions we have towards men and women and bring it all back to God's good design as outlined in his word. So, Nancy, on a more personal note, clearly you lecture and you teach other people outside of doing all these books and speaking events. What's your favorite or topic or book to have written on?
Well, that's tough, because each one is my favorite on that topic.
Yes.
You
It's
know,
like asking which one of your kids is favorite.
it's exactly the same. And I have to say, if I were forced to choose, I might choose my book, Saving Leonardo, because it's on the arts. It's on how philosophy and the arts interact. So it brings together the creative and the cognitive. It brings together the whole person. And so I probably enjoyed that one the most. But my first book, The Soul of Science, ended up in some ways being the most formative because the modern world all is inspired by science. Every philosophy out there is trying to make sense of science. So Christians are sometimes a little bit science phobic, and so I tell them, read my book, The Soul of Science, so that you'll get just enough science to understand the philosophical impact that it's had on the modern world. And then Love Thy Body was my most, right before this, dealing with issues of homosexuality, transgenderism, abortion. And these are issues that are just exploding today.
Yes.
People said, how did you know to start writing on transgenderism back then? Because it was not nearly as big an issue.
No.
And I like that one because it gives Christians a positive way to approach these issues instead of just, I'll tell you, I was on a panel at a Baptist church just last week, and there were four of the speakers, and every one of them was negative. It's, don't do it, it's wrong, it's a sin, it's against the Bible. And my book presents it positively as, honor your body, live in accord with the Creator's design. God has made your biology, he's made your body. And one way that we honor him is by living in harmony with our body. So it retrains Christians to speak more positively. And then Masculinity, my current book that we're talking about, you know what? It's the most personal in some ways because of the opening story.
Yes.
The opening story does talk about my own abusive childhood because I had a father who was severely physically abusive. In books on abuse, they sometimes ask, was it open hand or closed fist? And it was closed fist, with the middle knuckle extended to cause a sharper stab of pain. So it was pretty severe. He was punching and kicking us. And of course, as I grew up, the first thing I did was ricochet off into extreme feminism, right?
Yeah.
Thinking that men were cruel and vicious and terrible. And then I became a Christian in college and had to start rethinking this whole question. And so as I put it in my introduction, in a sense, I've been writing this book my whole life because I have had to be working through all my childhood trauma to work through to a positive, biblical, healthy concept of masculinity. I was interviewed by a Christian psychologist, and he said, well, at least we know you're not writing from an ivory tower. You're writing from the trenches. So, yeah, I've been there. This book is coming out of my own personal struggles.
Yeah, and I think it was a beautiful way to start it, to see, yes, you're coming at it from a personal experience. And I think it's important to note for those that haven't read the book listening to this, your dad was a minister. So you fully experienced this toxic masculinity hidden in Christianity and what that looked like for you. So
he was a professor.
a professor. Sorry, I thought it was a minister. Sorry.
Yeah, no, but he was adamant about attending church every Sunday, sitting in the front row, paying for Christian education, which actually was a good thing. It was a good Christian school up until 6th grade, at least. But yes, it was. We knew that for my parents, Christianity was the most important thing in the world. That was it. So even though he wasn't personally in the ministry, that was the message we got, is that, the most important thing in life is God. But the trouble is that then when I asked him one day, when I started having questions in high school, I asked my dad once point blank, "Why are you a Christian?" He said, "Works for me." I said, "That's it." He's a university professor. I expected something more substantial. I also had a chance to talk to a seminary dean who was my uncle, and I thought certainly I would get a better answer from him. But all he said was, "Don't worry, we all have doubts sometimes." And so I eventually decided, I guess Christianity just doesn't have any answers. And I very intentionally walked away from my Christian upbringing when I was about 16 years old, about halfway through high school, and embarked on a search for truth. So that's my interaction with my father was also a big reason, I think, that I walked away from my faith and had to claw my way back, through apologetics, through discovering that Christianity does actually have answers to the questions that all philosophies have to answer, and that it has better answers to all I picked up a whole host of secular philosophies, worldviews, and then had to figure out that Christianity actually had better answers. So that's kind of the nutshell story of my conversion.
Praise the Lord. And now here you are with all these books later on, helping the church grow in really tricky topics. So very thankful for that. And I love that. That's the Father we have, right? He doesn't let anything go to waste. He uses it and redeems it. And that's beautiful. So yeah, that's great. So in the Toxic War on Masculinity, I love how you break down the book really well. And just for our listeners, again, it answers a lot of common questions, such as like, where did the idea come from that masculinity is toxic? What impact did secularism have on the script of masculinity? How do Christian men shatter the negative stereotypes? So let's get stuck in, and I'm going to ask you all these questions because I particularly want to. Sorry, let me start here. For our listeners listening, I'm aware that there are other women and children that have been victims to toxic masculinity. And so we will touch on that towards the end, how the church should respond and how we should care for those and help those through that. But let's start first at the top and work our way through. And I'm going to address this assuming that some of you are not familiar with this whole toxic masculinity narrative that's going on and what that looks like. So maybe, Nancy, you could explain to us, what is the actual issue and what is actual masculinity and what is toxic masculinity?
Yeah, I think I'll start with a study, because it kind of unpacks this in a nice way. And I put this study at the beginning of the book. I'll tell you why. This is a little background that's not in the book. It's proven to be the most controversial book I've written, and I didn't really expect that. Love Thy Body, that dealt with homosexuality, transgenderism, right? So I thought that would be more controversial. But what happened is, I always teach my books in manuscript form, and I do reading groups. I like to get lots of feedback, right, to rub off the rough edges. But when people told their family and friends that they were going through a manuscript on masculinity, invariably the first question was, whose side is she on? With that tone of, men tended to assume that a woman writing a book on masculinity was going to be some kind of male bashing feminist, and more progressive types tended to assume that I was a angry defensive reactionary, and so I had to put this study right at the beginning of the book because it kind of helped overcome that initial hostility or suspicion. And it was a study done by a sociologist. He's not a Christian. Like I said, I use a lot of non-Christian sources in this book to broaden our perspective. Yeah, I know. I love it. I just read a Christian writer who said, who was giving advice to other writers and saying, you should be quoting non-Christian sources. And I thought, okay, I got that one down. I wanted to help people get out of sort of the Christian ghetto, the Christian subculture. And so the sociologist he gets invited to speak all around the world. And so he came up with this clever experiment where he asks young men two questions. First, he asks them, what does it mean to be a good man? If you're at a funeral and in the eulogy somebody says he was a good man, what does that mean? And the sociologist said young men had no trouble answering that question. They immediately started listing things like duty, honor, integrity, sacrifice, do the right thing, look out for the little guy, be a protector, be a provider, be responsible. And the sociologist would ask, where'd you learn that? And the young men would say, I don't know, it's just in the air we breathe. Or if they were in a Western country, they would often say, it's part of our Judeo-Christian heritage. So then he would follow up with a second question, and he'd say, what does it mean if I say to you, man up, be a real man? And the young men would say, oh no, that's completely different. That means be tough, be strong, never show weakness, win at all costs, suck it up, play through pain, be competitive, get rich, get laid. I'm using their language.
Yep.
And so the sociologist concluded that young men, or all men, he was focusing on young men because they're the ones who are problematic today. But they all had a sense of what it means to be a good man. It's universal, it's inherent, it's innate. We would say men are made in God's image. And so they do inherently know what it means to be a good man. Or we might chalk it up to general revelation, right? That means what we know just from being made in God's image and living in God's world, apart from special revelation, which is the Bible. And because this was universal, these weren't just Christian countries. But at the same time, young men do feel cultural pressure to live up to the quote unquote real man, which are quite different traits. And not all of them are bad, of course. But we all want men who can stand tough in a crisis. But when they get disconnected from a moral ideal of a good man, they can slide into more toxic traits like entitlement and control and dominance and so on. What we might call the Andrew Tate phenomenon, right? Fast cars, fast money, fast women. Andrew Tate specifically calls himself a pimp and says that he's producing pornography. He's quite open about it. But he's become a hero to so many young people today. I heard from one of my former graduate students recently. She sent me an email saying, what should I do? All my male students, she now teaches high school. All my male students are fans of Andrew Tate. They're even using Andrew Tate quotations in their yearbook. And I said, where are you teaching? She said, in a classical Christian school. So I thought, oh my, even, across the board, into the Christian world, young men are reaching out for models, and they're being drawn in sometimes by the secular definition of masculinity, which is today formulated more in the Andrew Tate pattern. There's a new influencer named Myron Gaines, who the New York Post described as the new Andrew Tate. And his slogan is, I help men transform from simps into pimps.
Oh my goodness.
And these are our influencers today. So now that's the need. That was the need I was addressing. Where is this coming from, and why are young men being drawn into it?
Yeah. And it's interesting to watch, because clearly that younger generation and the generation that are following them, and a lot of them are actually my age, so it's not just younger, they are somehow aligning with that conservative value that those guys tend to cloak their views in as well. Like they kind of blur the lines between what culture says and this conservative values as well. So I think it makes muddy waters for these guys to follow.
Yes, and I would say, the more men and boys fall behind, the more susceptible they are. The reason they're being drawn to that is because boys are falling behind at all levels of education, starting in kindergarten, right? They don't have the same fine motor control that girls have, so they have trouble using a scissors. Already in kindergarten, they feel like they're falling behind, and they're getting lower grades, lower test scores all the way through high school. More women than men are going to college. It's the average college now is 60% female, 40% male. And the women are more likely to go to graduate school and even professional school like law and medicine. So this is a real problem, that young men are falling behind in all levels of education. And then once they graduate, men are falling behind on several measures as well. Men are falling behind where they used to be in terms of higher suicide rates, higher mental health issues, higher rates of drug and alcohol addiction, homelessness, crime. 90% of prison inmates are male, and unemployment. This was a bit of a shock when I read that unemployment levels are now at Great Depression era levels, at least here in the States. And well, we remember what a crisis that was. So most of us don't realize it's actually reached that same level now, male unemployment has. And their life expectancy has gone down. So women's has stayed the same. So it's not a general trend. It's only male life expectancy that's gone down in recent years, to the point that a science magazine called The New Scientist said the major demographic factor now for early death is being male.
Yeah.
So I think it's time for us to say, can we have some compassion on men and boys? Can we start looking at perhaps ways to have programs that are geared towards helping men and boys succeed? One reason the girls are doing so well is because we did pour a lot of money into helping girls. And that's good. 1972, Title IX, 1994, Gender Equity Act, poured millions of dollars into workshops, equity workshops, curriculum, and training materials to help girls. But we've done nothing like that for boys, and then we're shocked that they're falling behind. It's time to say maybe there's a way to get some programs in that are geared to boys' distinctive learning styles, and that will help boys catch up with the girls.
Yeah. And so, like, on that note, I think it's easy to hear that and go, okay, but what does that even, like, how do we get there? How have we gotten to a place where we've allowed it to get so bad for men that it's impacting their age, it's impacting their job security and ability to have jobs, or maybe even the drive to be employed? How do we get here, Nancy? How do we get to such a toxic place?
That's why I do have a fair bit of history in the book, because I think we have to go back to where it started. Right? Most people would think the very idea that masculinity is toxic might have started in the 1960s with second wave feminism. If you hang around the manosphere, which is a name for the online groups of men's groups, many of them very hostile to women these days, they will usually say the culprit is feminism. No, it's not. You have to go much further back. You have to go all the way back to the. Pardon me?
That was me. I genuinely linked it solely to feminism. That's been probably the main reason why I hate feminism so much, is because it denigrates men. So, yeah.
But this was a big surprise to me. I went back in history, and if you go back to the Industrial Revolution, right? So that before that, men are working alongside their wives and children all day on the family farm, the family industry, the family business. So the cultural expectation on men focused on their caretaking role. In fact, this is an interesting historical fact. Most of the books on child rearing and parenting back then were addressed to fathers. Like if you go in a typical bookstore today, they're all addressed to mothers. But back then, they thought the father was the primary parent. And in fact, fathers did spend just as much time with their children as mothers did, which is hard for us to imagine.
Yeah.
And even secular historians, it's fun to read the secular historians and watch their description of this period, because it was very much a time. I'm sticking primarily with the U.S. in terms of my history, just to keep limits on it. But if you go back very far at all in Western history, Christianity, which was much stronger, of course, as a cultural force. And so even secular historians will say in the colonial era, the definition of masculine virtue was, quote, duty to God and man, unquote. So the question is, how did we lose that notion of masculine virtue? Well, the Industrial Revolution took work out of the home. And of course, men had to follow their work out of the home into offices and factories. And for the first time, men were not working alongside their family members, people that they loved and had a moral bond with. Instead, they were working as individuals in competition with other men. And that's where you first start to see the language change. People began to protest that men were losing the caretaking ethos of the colonial era, that they were becoming egocentric, self-centered, aggressive, greedy, acquisitive. I'm using the language of the day, and even making their career into an idol. Right? Instead of working for their family, they were starting to work for personal advancement and financial success. And so this is actually when you first start to see negative language applied to the male character. And that's why I say you have to go back this far. And it also, of course, gives you a different sense of what the solution is. If the problem started when men were disconnected from their families, then the solution has to be finding ways, even in our modern industrial era, are there ways that we can reconnect fathers to their families so that they can once again benefit from that close emotional connection with their wives and children? And of course, I do have a whole chapter on that, but if you want to go there, but that the big picture is we have to find a way to overcome the impact of the Industrial Revolution. And that was much deeper than feminist. And feminism wasn't even a big deal back then. There were hardly any feminists at the time. So this was not a feminist thing. The attacks on the male character were coming from very conservative Christian women who were very concerned to see men changing before their very eyes.
Yeah, and that's what I found so insightful about the book is that in reflection and understanding the history, even as you progress through the Industrial Revolution and how that process starts to break down, that women become the emotional beings and men become the practical, aggressive, there's this total breakdown over the course of decades that follows on from this Industrial Revolution as men grow further and further apart. And you even address alcohol, like culture and all this sort of stuff, like how all this impacted. But reading what it was like pre the Industrial Revolution completely shattered all the perceptions we have of fatherhood right now. And I think personally, the church is the only answer. So, and this is what your book highlights, the rise of secularization in culture that coincides with this Industrial Revolution and what happens after that follows from that. And the more we see God taken away in the world, the more we see the rise of this broken family unit. So maybe you could explain as well and elaborate on how the secularization of our culture also impacts this greatly and how we as a church, we actually have an answer. We can give it.
Yeah, so the Industrial Revolution also led to a very sharp public-private divide because when work was removed from the home, then suddenly you had the emergence of large public institutions, factories and offices and financial institutions and universities, and of course the state grew. And people began to argue that these large public institutions should operate by what they called scientific principles. But what they really meant by that was value free. In other words, don't bring your private values into the public realm, which is what we still hear today. And since it was men who were getting that secularized education and working in that secularized public realm, they did become secular first before women did. And so that was another important element in why the biblical ethic, began to lose its hold on men's hearts. They began to say, well, men are just naturally less religious. By the way, no one had said that before. No other culture has thought that men were naturally less religious or less moral. All the way back to the ancient Greeks and Romans, it was thought that men were morally stronger than women.
Yeah.
And their reasoning was this: the insight into right and wrong is a rational insight, and they thought men were more rational, and therefore they concluded that men are more virtuous. And in fact, the word virtue comes from the Latin word vir, means man, as in the word virile, right, manly. So virtue, actually, the word itself had overtones of manly strength and honor, whereas today we usually apply it to women. So men were sort of being let off the hook, right? They were being said, well, as long as you're working in the public square, you play by secular rules. And that was a way of releasing men from the moral expectations, moral and spiritual expectations. So that was an important step. And men, like you said, the behavior then began to grow worse. It's well known among historians that the 19th century was an era when there was a huge increase in drinking, which you mentioned, in gambling, in fighting, in crime, in gangs, and in prostitution. And in fact, that's why there was also a great flowering of reform movements to address all of this. And so our history gives us sort of a tension between men and women, because it was mostly traditionally male voices that were expanding in the 19th century. And then it was largely women leading these reform movements saying, you guys need to shape up. You need to come back to your biblical roots. It was women who were first trying to sort of re-Christianize the public square by bringing their men back to spiritual and moral values. And part of this, of course, was that, like I said, up until now, it was thought that men were morally superior. But when values were kicked out of the public square, where would they be cultivated? In the private sphere. And who's in the private sphere is women. So that was when the turning point came, when for the first time, women were thought to be morally and spiritually superior. So that was a huge. I've had students who said, "Oh, I thought that was just forever, right? Haven't we always thought that women were, more moral than men?" No, it's the 19th century that emerged for the first time ever in human history. And so the double standard that's what we call it today. By the way, I think it's still pretty common even in the church. I was interviewed by a young couple that was running a podcast, and they came from a very, very, very conservative Christian background. And so I asked them a question. I said, "Is the double standard still, operative in the Christian circles that you grew up?" And they said, "Oh, absolutely. It is still accepted that men are just naturally more prone to sin and vice. Men are just naturally going to be more drawn to pornography, for example. Men are, even in marriage, it's men who are going to be more naturally drawn to maybe committing adultery, and that it's women who have to hold them in check. It's women who have to hold them to a biblical standard." And this young couple said they feel like, growing up in a very conservative Christian arena, that this is the double standard that's still out there. And it started in the 19th century. So again, the history helps us so much in understanding where it came from, why it emerged, and what we should do about it. What we should do about it is stop letting men off the hook. We need to call men back to moral and spiritual leadership, which is what God calls them to, and not accept the notion that they're just naturally more prone to sin and vice, and more prone to temptation. No, that's not how God made them. God made them to be strong and spiritual leaders in the church and in the home.
Did you hear that, ladies? That is a call for us to rise up and support good, godly men, continue to encourage them into the word, encourage them in the role that they're playing in society and in our families, and to help grow all the other men around us. And I think that you're highlighting such a beautiful picture of what the church can do. If you have good, godly men exemplifying masculinity as outlined in Scripture, leading the family unit, leading their wives, washing them with the word, doing the things that Jesus has called them to do. And if the church works this way, even for the single guys, same thing again, it's not just for married men, then imagine how much we can bring forth a healthy image of masculinity and help tackle this war on masculinity that is taking place. So I guess on that note, seeing as we're talking about conservative Christian values and the church, I'm in evangelical reform circles, and complementarian views is like my church is complementarian. For those that are unfamiliar with that term, that would mean that men play specific roles as outlined in Scripture, in Timothy, and a few other verses, a few other books in the Bible, where men are to lead the church and to lead the home as the head. And I know some of you may be egalitarian, which means women can play the same role. And there's obviously a pendulum of belief and thoughts within that. So for those that are interested, I have done an episode on this called Women in the Church, and you can find a lot of resources on those two views. And that's a whole other topic for another day. However, I know that many people believe that a complementarian view within a church, with men being the head, can lead to abuse. And I think a lot of people just assume that the church is toxic when it comes to this and how this plays out, and thinks that the church allows a lot of abuse. However, you read this book and Nancy presents all the data, which is shocking and completely and utterly destroys that narrative, and also encourages Christians that are pursuing godly headship within the family, how incredibly healthy it is, and how much joy it brings. And so, Nancy, would you be able to share with us this encouragement and the data, and explain to us how that all works?
Yes, so this is the reason, the final reason I decided I had to write this book is when I ran across this data. I was reading sociologists, and well, to set it up, yes, you're right. The common cultural narrative is that evangelical men, because of the concept of headship, that theology will turn them into overbearing, abusive, tyrannical patriarchs. And so I'll give you just one example. I have several in the book, but just one. This was the co-founder of the Church Too movement, which followed the Me Too movement. And she says, the theology of male headship feeds the rape culture that we see permeating American Christianity today. And so the social scientists, psychologists, and sociologists were listening to this and saying, where's your evidence? You're making these accusations, but where's your data?
And they're
And so
huge
they went out and did the
accusations.
studies. Pardon?
And they're huge accusations. You can't just say that.
Exactly. And fortunately, more and more Christians are starting to go into the social sciences. And so they did the studies. And I quote about a dozen different studies in the book. And what they found is what you just said. Shockingly, they just shattered the negative stereotypes. Evangelical Christian men who attend church regularly test out as the top, as the most loving, engaged husbands and fathers. Their wives report the highest level of happiness. And by the way, yes, they are interviewed separately, which is important. And evangelical fathers spend more time with their kids, 3.5 more hours per week than secular men. Evangelical couples have the lowest rate of divorce, 20% lower than secular couples. And they have the lowest level of abuse and violence of any group in America. So this was astonishing. And when I read this, I said, this needs to get out into the public, first into the Christian public, into our churches, and then secondly into the public arena where we can shatter the secular stereotypes. I'll give you one quote. Sometimes the quote really crystallizes it. The sociologist who did the largest study was Brad Wilcox. He's at the University of Virginia. And to give you a sense of his stature, he gets published in places like the New York Times. And so this was a New York Times article. And he says, it turns out that the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. They're focusing on the wives, of course, because the assumption is that these marriages are oppressive to the wives. But no, the happiest of all wives in America are religious conservatives. Fully 73% of wives who hold conservative gender values and attend church regularly with their husbands have high quality marriages. And then he turns to his colleagues, who are mostly secular. Sociology is a very secular discipline. And he says, this is my favorite part actually, academics need to cast aside their prejudices against religious conservatives and against evangelicals in particular. Conservative Protestant married men with children are consistently the most engaged fathers and the most loving husbands. And this is not a pep talk from a religious leader. This is solid empirical research. This is evidence-based findings showing that evangelical men do test out, as well, as I put it in the subtitle of my book, Christianity does have the power to reconcile the sexes.
Yes, it does. Absolutely. And when I read all the data, I was just constantly reading out to my husband, look, see. Because, I feel like it's really important to the people listening. Reading this book equips you with the information like this. So when you speak to someone, either within the church or outside the church, you can actually correct the narrative, because people are spitting out incorrect truth, like lies, not incorrect truth, lies. And so we need to be able to wage war on that. And that's a really powerful tool to help raise the next generation with the right information and the right narrative.
And one reason that there is this misconception, though, this is we have to sort of give the other side of the coin too. And the pushback I always get is, but haven't we heard that Christian couples divorce at the same rate as the rest of the culture?
Yes, I've heard this one. Yeah.
Yeah, yes, you probably said it. um, I had before. So the researchers went back to the data, and they made that crucial distinction between evangelicals who do attend church regularly and people who claim an evangelical identity but who do not attend church. And the differences between them are absolutely shocking. So nominal Christian men, that means men who might, in a survey like this, they might check the Baptist box, for example, but they actually don't attend church, or rarely if at all. And they actually test out, in accord with all the toxic stereotypes, their wives report the lowest level of happiness. They are the least engaged with their children. They have the highest rate of divorce, even higher than secular men. And then the real shocker is that they have the highest rate of domestic abuse and violence, even higher than secular men. And so, Brad Wilcox, the sociologist that I quoted a minute ago, said he wrote an article in Christianity Today where he said the most violent husbands in America are evangelical Protestant men who don't attend church, who claim the identity but don't attend church, so that when they use phrases like headship and submission, they're not using a biblical definition. They're incorporating a secular definition from the secular script for masculinity and giving it sort of a Christian veneer. So that's really important to understand, that they will claim religious justification. By the way, I sometimes do get people asking me, well, why would they be worse? Why would they be even worse than secular men? And the answer is apparently it's because they think they have religious justification.
Yeah.
The average secular guy out there who might be hitting his wife and kids doesn't think he has any religious justification for that. But the nominal Christian thinks he does have religious justification, that, I'm the head of the home. She's supposed to submit to me. She wasn't submitting, so I had to put her in a place. These nominal Christians actually end up having the worst of both worlds and testing out as being worse than even secular men. So this is the challenge for the church, by the way, is on the one hand, how do we take this wonderful data showing that Christian men who are committed and attend church regularly are doing very well? We need to support them better than we have been. I think I constantly hear from men, because I wrote this book. I hear from men, right, who say that they feel like the church is really shaming men. I'll give you an example. One of my graduate students was the head of the women's ministry in a very large Baptist church here in Houston, and she said on Mother's Day we give the women roses. We hand out roses and tell the women they're wonderful. On Father's Day, we scold the men and tell them to do better.
Yeah.
And I thought, yes, that seems to be far too common. By the way, I carefully avoided the scolding tone in my book, as I think Christian men have enough of that. When I told my class at Houston Christian University that I was writing a book on masculinity, one of my male students shot back, "What masculinity? It's been beaten out of us."
Yeah, I remember
I
reading
thought,
that and
wow.
being like, oh, it's so true. And it's horrible to read that. It's just horrible.
So we should bring the good news out. Like I said, I had to go digging in the academic literature to find this. It's not out in the public yet. So we need to get the good news out. And then we need to challenge churches to, what are you going to do about all these nominals? All of these nominal men who are, in a sense, ruining the reputation of evangelicals because they're even worse than secular men. How do we bring them in from the fringes, they're kind of hanging around the fringes of the Christian world, bring them in and disciple them more effectively? We really need to think through how to disciple them because they're out there giving a secular definition, but claiming an evangelical identity.
Yeah, and I think you touch on this in your book as well. But the feminization of church as well is such a huge contributing factor to that, right? And I think sometimes I've met people that have gone to a more evangelical or reformed church, and they go, "It's very masculine." And I'm like, "Yeah, that's probably a good thing. It is a pendulum. It's been too far the other way." And we need to, yes, we need to find a middle ground, but maybe we need to go a little bit further to the masculine side just for now to get the guys back in and to get good teaching and to encourage the men that are already doing a good job. Um, that will help hopefully reach those nominal guys that you're talking about and help heal these families that are suffering as well. Touching on, we'll start wrapping this up because I want to honor your time, Nancy. I know you're very, very busy. I just have two questions, I guess. How can the church help uh, women, and how do we support women and families that are stuck in a marriage under toxic masculinity? How do we help those that are actually struggling?
Yes, I'm glad you brought that up because since nominal Christian men are even worse than secular men, I had to deal with that. But
Yeah,
otherwise, it would look like I was sweeping it under the carpet. So I do have two chapters on the subject.
yeah, you do.
And the good news is that Christian therapists and theologians have been changing their message. Until recently, the message was always the woman's responsible. Right. And I think that's partly just because it was usually the women who were looking for answers. Men who are abusive are not usually going for pastoral counseling. In fact, if they get any counseling, it's usually court ordered. That
Yeah.
was what I found when I was reading this. Every time I said, this man who was in counseling, I'd have to say court ordered counseling because that's the only way you get an abusive man into counseling usually. So I think it's partly just that it was the women who were coming for help, but the upshot then was most of the literature was written to women. If you were just more submissive, if you were more loving, if you were more forgiving, if you would make his favorite foods, if you would have sex more often, then, as one woman put it this way, she had a very abusive husband, and her pastor kept telling her, if you would do all these things, he will blossom into the man you want him to be. Well, actually, no, that's
No,
not
that
human
doesn't
nature.
work. That doesn't work.
It doesn't work. No, if somebody truly is a bully, if someone really truly is willing to hurt the people around him, being nicer to him doesn't usually work. Being nicer to him is interpreted as, well, she doesn't mind. I can get away with it. We know that when it's, a bully on the playground. We know that if it's a belligerent nation in international affairs, but somehow we didn't apply it to marriage. But there've been a slew of books. They're pretty recent. If you're in this situation, do read my end notes because I'll give you the best books that are available now on the subject. But finally, theologians and Christian therapists are starting to say the answer to abuse in Christian homes is what Jesus told us in Matthew 18, right? If somebody's sinning, you call them on it. You have to have a way of holding them accountable. And if they don't listen to you, you bring on a couple more witnesses, right? And if they don't listen to them, you bring it before the church. And if they don't listen to the church, there might be a need for some kind of church discipline. So Jesus gave us the answer in Matthew 18. It's just that up until recently, people have not really applied that very often to marriage. But now you're starting to see books that support women and saying, if he's sinning against you, the answer is Matthew 18. It is time to say, what you're doing is wrong. And theologians, Stephen Tracy at Phoenix Seminary is one of the main theologians that I draw on. And he said, the church needs to stand behind women and tell them that they do have a right to stand up to men who are disrespecting them. And the church should have their back. When they have to stand up to a man who's disrespecting or abusing them, they should know they have the church at their back. And that has not been the case in the past. Unfortunately, largely it is the church that's been telling women, well, it's your fault if you would just do more of this, more of that. So it is there has been a change. I wrote this book at the right time because we now have some really good literature helping women to say, yes, it is valid for you to not put up with abuse, and telling churches, yes, you should support women when it comes to and sometimes it's men, of course,
Yes.
So you have to always say yes. Sometimes the abuse goes the other way, but numerically speaking, statistically speaking, it's more likely to be the man, and I think that makes sense. In the men are bigger, stronger, have more economic power.
Naturally.
It's not at all surprising when somebody with power is more tempted to abuse it. So it's not surprising that depending on the stats, 65-70% of the time it is the man who's abusive. Anyway, so yes, I'm glad you asked that question because I found some really wonderful books, and I would strongly urge you to look at some of my endnotes if you're in this kind of position. There's good resources out there now.
There really is. And I'm very encouraged to see the training that has been put into this in seminaries, in Bible colleges for pastors coming out to be aware of what domestic violence looks like, how we approach that with a biblical perspective. And I've actually been really glad to hear, and I know personally I worked in the NGO world for a while with women with victims of domestic violence, and it's been great to see pastors saying things like, you need safety, you need to get out, you don't stay there, and there's other ways and avenues that we can look for reconciliation and do that in a way that's still respectful, but you are not in danger, and you should never be in danger. That is not headship how God created it. And I'm really encouraged, I have to say, with the rise of covenant households and covenant theology happening within the church as well, and how a lot of the head guys that speak on that are really pushing back on men that what real headship looks like, which is laying oneself down for the other. And so I think that's a really great way. I have so many more questions, Nancy, but I'm not going to take up all your time. I would love to have gone into the family unit, how we can bring the boys up for the next generation and how we can help combat that, because I, as a mum of 4 kids and I have 2 boys, I see it, the education system is so geared towards girls and we box boys in, and it's just horrible to see. But your book does elaborate on all of that. It does explain that. So for my dear listeners that are going, I've got all these other questions, please get Nancy's book. I cannot recommend it enough. It will take you a little while to read it because there's so much information that I had to reread. Sometimes I'll be like, am I reading this correctly? But I highly recommend it. And like I said, I've got plenty of questions, but I think you'll find your answers in the book here. Nancy, thank you so much for your time. I really appreciate it. I hope you have.
Well, thanks so much for inviting me. Yes, excellent questions. And I've only been to Australia once. I was in Melbourne once, speaking at an education conference, speaking to educators. So that was, and then we also went to Australia Zoo. My son was a huge fan of Steve Irwin, and so as long as we were close, we had to go to Australia Zoo. And he even recognized some of the crocodiles and alligators, because they had names, right? They had names.
Oh, wow.
And so some of them, he said, I remember that one from the Steve Irwin show. I remember that crocodile.
That's amazing.
That was a real highlight.
Well, hopefully we can have you here soon. My dream is to one day have a her theology conference. So we will see, God willing. Maybe I can get you in for that, because Australia is very blessed. I know a lot, like I said, a lot of women follow your stuff and love what you do. And so that's our goal. We'll try and get you here. Do a tour around Australia. Churches would love you.
Well, I love your idea of doing theology, that women need to understand theology. I think churches too often underestimate women's intellectual abilities. They have programs for women are usually very light and kind of practical, and if anything, somewhat emotional. And women should be learning theology. They should be having meat. Even Paul says, you got to be ready to eat meat. Get past the milk and have something more solid. And so I when I read the title of your show, I knew I was already smitten right then and there.
Oh, thank you.
I'm so glad that you're emphasizing theology for women.
Yeah, no, that's exactly right. I think women, we can bring a lot to the table. So, we should. And I know men can benefit from it. And I love having a good theological debate with my male friends. I actually do a Bible study with 6 other guys. I'm the only girl. and they're all reformed and they battle it out. But it's so fun. It's great. I might not know all the answers, so that's my hope for all women, that we get to that place. So it's not just for men. It's a good stuff. It's a good thing. Yeah. Well, thank you, Nancy. I hope you have a great rest of the day. For our listeners, thank you so much. If you have found this episode insightful and helpful, I cannot ask you enough. Please like and share it with your friends and family. That is the best way for it to get out. Word of mouth is always the most powerful. Share it on social media. Subscribe to whatever platform you're listening to this. And otherwise, I hope you have a great day.